The bombs fell like rain from heaven, and they might as well have been raindrops for all the damage they did. 20,000 feet above the Bismarck Sea, B-17 flying fortresses released their payloads with mathematical precision, bombardiers peering through Norden bomb sites that cost more than the aircraft carrying them. The bombs tumbled earthward through thin air, spinning lazily as they accelerated toward terminal velocity. 40 seconds. That was how long it took for a bomb dropped from 4 miles up to reach the ocean surface below. 40 seconds for a Japanese destroyer captain to glance at the sky, bark an order, and watch his helmsman spin the wheel 15 degrees. The bomb splashed harmlessly into empty water, geysers erupting where the ship had been moments before. The hit rate was less than 1%. One bomb in 100 found its target. The United States Army Air Force, equipped with the most sophisticated bombing technology ever devised, was missing 99 times out of 100. Down below, the Tokyo Express ran with impunity. Japanese convoys steamed through the Solomon Islands and along the New Guinea coast, reinforcing garrisons that should have been starving, delivering troops that should have been stranded, turning what should have been isolated outposts into fortified strongholds. The Americans owned the sky, but the Japanese owned the sea lanes, and altitude was proving to be the enemy of accuracy. Physics was simple and brutal. The higher you flew, the safer you were, and the more useless your bombs became. The B-25 Mitchell medium bombers were no better. Designed as defensive platforms, they carried their bombs internally, approached targets at medium altitude, and relied on bombardiers to aim through glass noses while enemy anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a lattice of exploding steel. The doctrine was clear, the procedures were established, and the results were catastrophic. Japanese ships continued to sail. Japanese troops continued to land, and the New Guinea campaign ground forward at a pace measured in blood per yard. Something had to change. Someone had to change it. Major Paul Irvin Gunn was 43 years old, ancient by the standards of military aviation, where most combat pilots were young enough to be his sons. They called him Pappy, and the nickname fit. His face was weathered, creased with lines that spoke of decades in cockpits, his hair graying at the temples. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to conserve energy, who understood that wars were marathons rather than sprints. But there was nothing tired about his eyes. They burned with something cold and focused, something that went beyond professional competence or patriotic duty. Rage, pure, distilled, carefully controlled rage. Gunn had been a naval aviator in the previous war, back when aircraft were canvas and wood, when flying itself was an act of courage. After the Navy, he had become a civilian pilot, one of the barnstormers and airmail carriers who built commercial aviation from nothing. By the late 1930s, he was flying for Philippine Airlines, shuttling passengers and cargo through the islands, building a life in Manila with his wife Polly and their 4 children. December 1940, one had ended that life with brutal finality. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines had caught thousands of American civilians in its path. Gunn had been away from Manila when the city fell, flying reconnaissance missions for the Army Air Force, watching from the sky as the world he had built collapsed into occupation and imprisonment. Polly and the children, Pappy Jr., Nathaniel, Julie, and Connie, had been swept up with thousands of other civilians and herded into Santo Tomas internment camp, a former university converted into a prison. The reports that filtered out were sparse and horrifying: starvation, ration, disease, brutality. Children growing thin and hollow-eyed behind barbed wire while their father flew missions thousands of miles away, powerless to reach them. That powerlessness had transformed Gunn from a competent officer into something else entirely. He became obsessed, driven by a singular purpose that consumed every waking moment. The war was no longer an abstract conflict between nations and ideologies. It was personal. It was about his wife and his children suffering in a prison camp while Japanese convoys ran supplies with impunity, while Japanese garrisons grew stronger, while the war dragged on month after month with no end in sight. Gunn needed a weapon. Not just any weapon, but something violent enough, devastating enough to break the back of Japanese logistics. Something that could sink ships faster than they could be replaced, that could turn the ocean into a graveyard, that could shorten the war by months or years. Something that could bring him to Manila before his family starved to death behind those walls. The problem was clear. High-altitude bombing did not work against ships. The physics were immutable, the mathematics unforgiving. Bombs fell too slowly, ships maneuvered too quickly, and the ocean was too vast for near misses to matter. The solution, when it came to Gunn, was equally clear, though it violated every principle of aircraft design and tactical doctrine. If bombs dropped from high altitude could not hit ships, then aircraft would have to attack from low altitude. Not medium altitude, not tactical altitude, but wavetop altitude, so low that pilots could taste salt spray, so low that ships' main guns could not depress far enough to fire back. And if aircraft were going to fly that low, into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire from every gun that could bear, they would need to suppress those guns first. They would need overwhelming firepower, the kind of firepower that could shred gun crews and destroy firing positions before the enemy could respond. They would need to become flying gun platforms, weapons delivery systems that happen to have wings. The B-25 Mitchell was the wrong aircraft for this mission. It was designed as a bomber, with a glass nose for the bombardier, defensive gun positions, and bomb bays optimized for high-altitude release. Everything about its configuration assumed it would attack from above, would rely on altitude for protection, would depend on bombardiers rather than pilots to aim its weapons. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw something different. Saw fuselage, engines, and wings. He saw a platform that could carry weight and absorb punishment. He saw potential. The glass nose would have to go. The bombardier position would have to be eliminated. In their place, Gunn envisioned something the aviation engineers would call impossible. A battery of fixed forward-firing machine guns, mounted in the nose, aimed by the pilot, fired in devastating volleys that would turn the aircraft into a flying gun emplacement. He was going to build a weapon violent enough to save his family, and he was going to build it whether the engineers approved or not. The proposal landed on desks at North American Aviation's engineering department like a live grenade. Strip the bombardier station, remove the glass nose, pack the forward fuselage with 4.50 caliber machine guns, all firing forward, all controlled by the pilot. Add 2 more in side-mounted pods, keep the 2 in the forward turret. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, all firing simultaneously, transforming a medium bomber into what Gunn called a flying shotgun. The engineers did the math and declared it suicide. 4.50 caliber machine guns firing together generated recoil force equivalent to several tons. The nose section of a B-25, designed to carry a bombardier and his delicate instruments, was built light. It had to be. Every pound mattered in aircraft design, and the nose was never intended to absorb the hammering punishment of sustained automatic weapons fire. The engineers calculated stress loads, examined frame specifications, and reached a unanimous conclusion. The recoil would snap the nose clean off the fuselage. The aircraft would disintegrate in midair, killing everyone aboard. Even if the structural failure did not occur immediately, the vibration would. 8 machine guns firing created harmonic frequencies that would shatter every piece of plexiglass in the cockpit. The pilots would be blinded by flying glass, choked by cordite smoke, deafened by the cacophony of weapons fire in an enclosed metal tube. The aircraft would become unflyable within seconds. And then there was the weight distribution problem. Mounting 4 heavy machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition in the nose would shift the center of gravity forward, making the aircraft dangerously nose-heavy. On takeoff, the pilot would fight a constant tendency to pitch downward. One moment of inattention, one slight overcorrection, and the aircraft would auger straight into the runway, cartwheeling in a ball of aviation fuel and high explosives. The engineers had a name for Gunn's proposal, the suicide box. They wrote detailed reports explaining why it could not work, would not work, should not even be attempted. They cited stress calculations, vibration analysis, and center of gravity computations. They appealed to physics, to engineering principles established over decades of aircraft design, to common sense. Gunn ignored every word. He was not an engineer in the formal sense, had never attended university, had never studied structural mechanics or aerodynamic theory. What he possessed was something the engineers lacked: decades of practical experience keeping aircraft flying with whatever materials came to hand, and the absolute certainty that comes from having nothing left to lose. His workshop was a commandeered corner of an Australian airfield maintenance hangar, filled with scavenged parts, borrowed tools, and equipment that officially did not exist. The Royal Australian Air Force scrap piles became his supply depot. Damaged aircraft yielded shock absorbers, springs, felt padding, metal stock. Gunn studied the recoil problem not as an abstract engineering challenge, but as a mechanical puzzle with a practical solution. The engineers wanted to bolt the guns rigidly to the airframe, treating them as fixed structural elements. Gunn saw immediately why this would fail. Rigid mounting meant every ounce of recoil force transferred directly into the aluminum frame, creating stress concentrations that would crack welds and pop rivets. The solution was not to make the mounting stronger, but to make it flexible. He designed what he called a spider mount, a suspension system that allowed the guns to move. Each weapon sat in a cradle that could slide backward against heavy springs. When the gun fired, instead of transferring all its energy into the airframe, it pushed back against the springs, which absorbed the force gradually. Shock absorbers, scavenged from landing gear, dampened the motion. Felt pads cut from damaged aircraft seats cushioned the impact points where metal met metal. The guns would float, suspended in a web of springs and dampers, moving backward with each burst and returning to battery as the springs reasserted themselves. The recoil energy would dissipate through the suspension system rather than hammering into the airframe. It was garage engineering, built from scrap and intuition, and it violated every principle of proper aircraft modification. Gunn worked 18-hour days, welding, fitting, testing. His hands were perpetually burned from hot metal, stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. He fabricated parts on lathes, bent metal stock with hammers, and assembled components that existed in no manual or technical specification. The spider mount grew organically, modified and refined through trial and error, each iteration slightly different from the last. The ammunition feed system presented its own challenges. 8 guns firing simultaneously consumed bullets at a prodigious rate. Standard ammunition boxes would empty in seconds. Gunn designed extended feed chutes that snaked through the fuselage, connecting to larger capacity magazines. He calculated firing times, ammunition loads, and weight distributions on the back of cigarette packages and scrap paper. But firepower alone would not solve the shipping problem. Even with 8 machine guns, a B-25 attacking from medium altitude would be torn apart by anti-aircraft fire before it could inflict significant damage. The aircraft had to come in low, wave top low, where ship's main armament could not depress far enough to engage. And if they were coming in that low, they needed a way to deliver bombs with precision. Skip bombing. The concept was simple, the execution terrifying. Instead of dropping bombs from altitude and hoping they fell somewhere near the target, aircraft would approach at 50 feet, flying perfectly level at 200 miles per hour. The bombs would release just above the water, strike the surface at a shallow angle, and skip like flat stones across a pond. With properly delayed fuses, the bombs would skip once, twice, perhaps 3 times, then slam into the ship's hull at the waterline before detonating. The technique required precision, flying that bordered on suicidal. 50 feet above the ocean at 200 miles per hour left zero margin for error. A moment's inattention, a slight downdraft, and the aircraft would cartwheel across the water in a spray of disintegrating aluminum. The pilot had to hold altitude and heading perfectly while anti-aircraft fire filled the air around him, while his own guns hammered and vibrated, while smoke and noise turned the cockpit into chaos. Gunn found a practice target, the SS Pruth, a wrecked freighter sitting in shallow water off the Australian coast. Day after day, he flew practice runs, coming in low and level, releasing practice bombs, studying the skip patterns. He refined the approach angle, the release timing, the altitude. He discovered that bombs released at precisely 50 feet with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse would skip 2 or 3 times before striking the target hull. The other pilots watched these practice runs with a mixture of awe and horror. Gunn flew lower than anyone thought possible, his propellers leaving wakes in the water, his wingtips nearly brushing the waves. He developed a saying that became doctrine: if you're not leaving a wake with your propellers, you're too damn high. The first complete strafer sat in the hangar like a mechanical nightmare. The glass nose was gone, replaced by a blunt metal snout bristling with gun barrels. The spider mounts were visible through access panels, a tangle of springs and shock absorbers that looked more like industrial machinery than aircraft components. Ammunition boxes filled every available space in the forward fuselage. The whole assemblage looked jury-rigged, temporary, dangerous. North American Aviation engineers who saw photographs called it a death trap. They pointed out that no wind tunnel testing had been performed, no structural analysis completed, no flight characteristics evaluated. The modification was so extensive that it essentially created a new aircraft, one that had never been properly designed or certified. Gunn scheduled the first test flight and climbed into the cockpit alone. He refused to risk anyone else on an aircraft that every qualified engineer insisted would kill its crew. If the nose was going to snap off, if the vibration was going to shatter the cockpit, if the weight distribution was going to cause an unrecoverable dive, it would happen to him and him alone. The engine started normally. The aircraft taxied without obvious problems, though Gunn could feel the nose-heavy tendency immediately. It took constant back pressure on the yoke to keep the tail down, and he made a mental note to add ballast to the rear fuselage. The takeoff roll was longer than standard, the aircraft reluctant to rotate, but it lifted eventually and climbed into clear Australian sky. At altitude, Gunn trimmed the aircraft as best he could and prepared to fire the guns. He had loaded only a few hundred rounds per gun, enough to test the system without committing to a full combat load. His thumb hovered over the firing button. Every engineer in 2 countries had told him this moment would be his last. He pressed the button. The noise was beyond description, beyond anything he had experienced in decades of flying. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a sound that was felt rather than heard, a physical pressure wave that hammered through the cockpit. The aircraft shuddered, slowed perceptibly in midair as recoil fought against forward momentum. Smoke filled the cockpit instantly, cordite fumes so thick he could barely see the instruments, but the nose stayed attached. The plexiglass did not shatter, the rivets held. The spider mounts absorbed the recoil exactly as designed, the guns sliding backward against their springs, the shock absorbers dampening the motion. The impossible scrapyard contraption worked. The test flight data was undeniable, though it read like a catalog of problems that should have grounded the aircraft permanently. The modified B-25 was nose-heavy, requiring constant trim adjustments and muscular control inputs. It handled, in Gunn's words, like a truck loaded with cement. The rate of climb was reduced, the ceiling lowered, the range shortened by the weight of ammunition and guns. When all 8 machine guns fired simultaneously, the aircraft decelerated noticeably, as if it had deployed an invisible parachute. The recoil literally slowed the plane in midair, momentum bleeding away as thousands of rounds per minute hammered forward. Inside the cockpit, conditions were nightmarish. The noise was physically painful, a hammering roar that made communication impossible and left ears ringing for hours afterward. Gunpowder smoke filled the enclosed space within seconds, reducing visibility to arm's length and forcing pilots to fly partially by instruments even in clear weather. The smell of cordite became so thick it could be tasted, a bitter chemical tang that clung to clothing and skin. Spent shell casings clattered through the fuselage, bouncing off metal surfaces, accumulating in drifts around the pilot's feet. Every conventional metric said the aircraft was worse than the standard B-25. It was slower, clumsier, more difficult to fly, and turned the cockpit into an environment that bordered on uninhabitable. By every measure that aviation engineers considered important, Gunn's modification was a failure. But the nose stayed attached. The glass did not shatter. The rivets held. The spider mount suspension system absorbed recoil forces that should have torn the aircraft apart, dissipating energy through springs and shock absorbers instead of transferring it into the aluminum airframe. The impossible had become merely difficult, and difficult was something Gunn could work with. He flew more test flights, refining the ballast placement, adjusting the ammunition load distribution, developing procedures for managing the smoke and noise. Other pilots began training on the strafer, learning to handle the nose-heavy characteristics, to fire in short bursts to manage recoil, to tolerate conditions inside the cockpit that would have been rejected as unacceptable in any other context. They practiced skip bombing runs on the Pruth wreck, coming in at 50 feet, holding steady while their own guns hammered, releasing bombs that skipped across the water and slammed into the rusted hull. The hit rate climbed steadily, 10%, 20%, 30%. Numbers that would have been impossible from high altitude became routine at wave-top level. The pilots learned to trust the technique to fly lower than instinct said was safe, to ignore the spray kicked up by their propellers and focus on holding altitude and heading with absolute precision. By late February 1943, Gunn had a squadron of modified strafers and crews trained to use them. What he did not have was a target worthy of the weapon he had built. The Tokyo Express convoys had grown cautious, running at night, hugging coastlines where land-based fighters could provide cover. The opportunity for a decisive engagement seemed to be slipping away. Then intelligence reported a major Japanese convoy forming at Rabaul. 8 destroyers, 8 troop transports, 7,000 soldiers bound for New Guinea, where they would reinforce a garrison that was becoming a major threat to Allied operations. The convoy would have to cross the Bismarck Sea, several hundred miles of open water where air power could reach it. High Command ordered an attack, expecting the usual high-altitude bombing runs that would achieve the usual negligible results. Gunn saw something different. He saw the perfect proving ground for his strafers, the target that would validate or condemn months of unauthorized modification work. He lobbied for permission to use his aircraft, arguing that this was exactly the scenario they had been designed for. A large, slow-moving convoy with no room to maneuver concentrated targets that could not evade at close range. Permission came grudgingly, hedged with restrictions and skepticism. The strafers would be part of a larger attack force, not the primary strike element. If they failed, conventional bombers would finish the job. The tone was clear. This was a test, and failure would end the strafer program permanently. March 3, 1943 dawned clear over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy steamed in formation, destroyers screening the transports, confident in their ability to evade high-altitude bombers. They had done it dozens of times before, watching bombs fall harmlessly into empty ocean while they maneuvered away. Their lookouts scanned the sky for the high-altitude formations that always preceded attacks. The strafers came in at 50 feet, hugging the ocean's surface, a line of aircraft spread abreast like a wall of aluminum traveling at 200 miles per hour. The Japanese lookouts spotted them too late, their warnings drowned in the sudden roar of engines and guns. Australian Beaufighters swept in first, suppressing anti-aircraft positions with their own forward-firing armament, clearing the way for the heavier B-25s. Then the strafers opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns per aircraft, multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously, created a storm of metal that defied description. The bullets did not simply penetrate, they disintegrated everything they touched. Steel plating designed to stop shell fragments dissolved under the hammering impact. Gun crews vanished, shredded before they could train their weapons. Bridge windows exploded inward, showering officers with glass and lead. The physical force went beyond mere bullets, becoming something closer to a solid wall of destruction that swept across the ship's superstructures. Major Ed Larner flew so low his aircraft had to pull up sharply to avoid hitting ship masts. His gunner later reported seeing Japanese sailors diving overboard, choosing the ocean over the metal storm tearing through their vessels. The noise was audible even over the aircraft engines, a sustained ripping sound like canvas tearing, magnified 1,000 times. Behind the strafers came the skip bombers, releasing their weapons at precisely 50 feet, watching them bounce across the water like stones skipped by giants. The delayed fuses worked perfectly. Bombs struck ship hulls at the waterline, penetrated below the armor belt, and detonated inside the vessels. Explosions blossomed along the convoy line, orange fireballs rising from transport after transport. The hit rate was nearly 50%. 1 bomb in 2 found its target, a number that would have been impossible from high altitude, that represented a 50-fold improvement over conventional bombing. Ships that had dodged bombs for months found themselves unable to evade weapons that skipped across the water faster than they could turn. The physics that had protected them at high altitude became their doom at wave-top level. The battle lasted 3 days as Allied aircraft returned again and again to finish crippled vessels and strafe survivors in the water. The results were devastating beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. All 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk, the others damaged and fleeing. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers killed, drowned, or left floating in life jackets to be strafed by subsequent attacks. Fewer than 900 reached land. The American losses: 13 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than enemy fire. The numbers represented one of the most lopsided victories in naval warfare history. A convoy that should have reinforced a critical garrison instead became a graveyard at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The Tokyo Express, which had run with impunity for over a year, effectively ceased to exist. Japanese commanders realized that daylight convoy operations were no longer viable, that the Americans had developed a weapon against which they had no defense. Gun strafers had achieved in 3 days what months of high-altitude bombing had failed to accomplish. The scrapyard modifications, the jury-rigged spider mounts, the technique that every engineer had called impossible, had broken the back of Japanese naval logistics in the Southwest Pacific. Ships could no longer reinforce garrisons, could no longer supply forward bases, could no longer operate in waters where Allied air power could reach them. The strategic implications rippled outward. New Guinea garrisons that had been growing stronger began to starve Japanese commanders who had planned offensives found themselves unable to move troops or supplies. The entire calculus of the Pacific campaign shifted as the ocean, previously a highway for Japanese reinforcement, became a killing ground. North American Aviation engineers stopped laughing at the suicide box. They stopped writing reports about why it could not work. Instead, they sent teams to Australia to measure guns modifications, to photograph the spider mounts, to interview the pilots who had flown the strafers into combat. The scrapyard engineering that had been dismissed as dangerous improvisation became the subject of intense study. The factory began incorporating Gunn's design into production aircraft. The B-25J model, designated the strafer configuration, rolled off assembly lines with solid noses, fixed forward-firing guns, and suspension systems based directly on Gunn's spider mount. The modifications that had been cobbled together from scrap metal and intuition became standardized, mass-produced, official. Technical manuals were rewritten. Doctrine was revised. The impossible became standard procedure. Gunn was not finished innovating. If 850 caliber machine guns could devastate ships, what could a 75mm cannon do? He began mounting field artillery pieces in B-25 noses, creating flying tank destroyers that could engage ships from 2 miles away. The recoil from a 75mm cannon almost stopped the aircraft in mid-air, popped rivets throughout the fuselage, and required extensive structural reinforcement. It also worked, turning medium bombers into platforms capable of sinking destroyers with single well-placed shells. The war in the Pacific had changed fundamentally. Japanese ships no longer sailed in daylight within range of Allied airfields. Convoys that had once run regularly became rare and heavily escorted. The reinforcement of forward positions became a desperate nighttime gamble rather than a routine operation. And in Santo Tomas internment camp, though Gunn could not know it, his family continued to survive on starvation rations, growing thinner and weaker, waiting for liberation that seemed impossibly distant. The Battle of Bismarck Sea had proven the strafer concept beyond any doubt, but for Gunn it was only the beginning. Every ship sunk shortened the war by days or weeks. Every convoy destroyed brought liberation closer. The weapon he had built from scrap and rage was working exactly as intended, and he would continue refining it, improving it, making it more lethal, until the day he could finally reach Manila and bring his family home. The engineers from North American Aviation arrived in Australia with notebooks, cameras, and measuring tools, their skepticism replaced by urgent curiosity. They photographed every angle of Gunn's spider mount system, measured spring tensions, documented shock absorber placements, interviewed mechanics about maintenance procedures. The scrapyard modifications that had been dismissed as suicidal improvisation were now being reverse-engineered for mass production. Men in suits who had written reports explaining why the concept could not work now wrote reports explaining how to replicate it on factory assembly lines. The B-25J strafer model began rolling off production lines in Kansas. each aircraft incorporating design elements that Gunn had welded together from salvaged parts in an Australian maintenance hangar. The solid nose, the forward-firing gun battery, the suspension system that allowed weapons to float rather than being rigidly mounted, all became standard configuration. Technical manuals were rewritten to include procedures that had been developed through trial and error over the Bismarck Sea. Training programs taught pilots techniques that Gunn had invented while flying low enough to leave propeller wakes in the ocean. The impossible had become doctrine. The suicide box had become standard equipment. Gunn himself continued pushing boundaries that conventional wisdom said should not be pushed. 850 caliber machine guns had proven devastatingly effective, but he envisioned something more powerful still. A 75mm field artillery cannon mounted in the nose of a B-25, transforming a medium bomber into a flying tank destroyer. The concept violated every principle of aircraft design even more egregiously than the machine gun installation. A 75mm cannon firing a 14-pound shell generated recoil forces that dwarfed anything the 50 calibers produced. He mounted one anyway, fabricating a cradle system that allowed the massive weapon to slide backward nearly 2 feet with each shot. The first test firing almost tore the aircraft apart. Rivets popped throughout the forward fuselage, metal panels buckled, and the aircraft decelerated so violently that the pilot thought the engines had failed. But the nose stayed attached, the structure held, and the shell struck its target with devastating accuracy from 2 miles away. Gunn had created a weapon that could engage ships from beyond the range of most anti-aircraft guns, that could punch through armor plating with single shots, that could sink destroyers without ever entering their defensive envelope. The 75mm strafers went into limited production, used primarily against hardened targets and heavily armored vessels. They were difficult to fly, punishing to maintain, and required pilots with exceptional skill to manage the recoil forces. But they worked, adding another weapon to the arsenal that was systematically destroying Japanese naval capabilities in the Southwest Pacific. By late 1944, the war had turned decisively. Japanese merchant shipping had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war capacity, strangled by submarines, aircraft, and mines. The island garrisons that had once seemed impregnable were isolated and starving, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The Philippines, occupied since early 1942, were being liberated island by island as American forces advanced westward. Gunn flew mission after mission, his aircraft now bearing the marks of a senior officer and experienced combat pilot. He had been promoted, decorated, recognized officially for innovations that had changed the nature of aerial warfare. But the recognition meant nothing compared to the single objective that had driven him for 3 years, reaching Manila and freeing his family from Santo Tomas. Then, during a low-level attack mission, his aircraft was hit. Anti-aircraft fire found the range, shells exploding close enough to shred control surfaces and puncture fuel tanks. The B-25 went down in the Philippine jungle, crashing through canopy and slamming into the forest floor. Gunn survived the impact but emerged from the wreckage with severe injuries. White phosphorus from tracer rounds had burned into his flesh, creating wounds that would not heal cleanly. One finger was gone, torn away in the crash. His left arm was mangled, bones broken and muscles torn. Degree burns covered portions of his body, the kind of injuries that ended flying careers permanently. Flight surgeons examined the 45-year-old pilot with the crippled hand and the burns that still wept fluid, and they grounded him immediately. The decision was medical, final, and completely reasonable. Men in Gunn's condition did not fly combat aircraft. The physical demands were too great, the risks too high, the likelihood of further injury too certain. Gunn ignored the medical grounding the same way he had ignored the engineering reports declaring his modifications impossible. He talked, argued, pulled strings, called in favors, and somehow convinced commanders to restore his flight status. The crippled hand could still grip a control yoke. The burns would heal eventually. The mangled arm retained enough function to operate throttles and switches. He had not come this far, had not built these weapons, had not survived 3 years of combat, to be grounded by doctors when liberation was finally within reach. February 3, 1945. The 1st Cavalry Division rolled through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp, finding 3,700 civilians in various stages of starvation. They had survived 3 years on 700 calories per day, watching friends and family die from malnutrition and disease, clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing month. The camp was a vision of hell. Skeletal figures in rags, children with distended bellies and hollow eyes, adults too weak to stand without assistance. Among the survivors were Polly, Gunn, and all 4 children. Pappy Jr., Nathaniel, Julie, and Connie had endured 3 years of imprisonment, had watched their rations dwindle to near nothing, had survived diseases that killed others around them. They were painfully thin, marked by hardship in ways that would never fully heal, but they were alive, all of them. Against odds that had seemed impossible, against a timeline that had stretched beyond endurance, they had survived. Word reached Gunn within hours. His 3-year mission to build a machine violent enough to save his family had succeeded. Every ship sunk, every convoy destroyed, every innovation that shortened the war by days or weeks had contributed to this moment. The strafers that had broken Japanese logistics, the skip bombing technique that had turned the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard, the unauthorized modifications that had changed aerial warfare, all of it had been in service of this single objective. The only victory that truly mattered to him had been achieved. After the war ended, Gunn turned down every Pentagon desk job and promotion offered to him. He had no interest in peacetime military bureaucracy, in committees and paperwork and the slow grinding machinery of a peacetime air force. He returned to the Philippines, started Philippine Airlines again, and went back to civilian flying. The man who had revolutionized aerial combat went back to hauling cargo and passengers through the islands, flying the same routes he had flown before the war, as if the intervening years had been an interruption rather than a transformation. January 16, 1957. Gunn was 57 years old, still flying, still refusing to accept that age and old injuries should ground him. A storm caught his aircraft near Manila, the kind of weather that sensible pilots avoided and that Gunn had flown through countless times before. This time the aircraft went down. The crash killed him instantly. Men like Pappy Gunn, people said afterward, do not die in bed. They die in cockpits, doing what they were born to do on their own terms until the very end. His legacy lived on in ways he never saw. The A-10 Warthog, designed decades later, embodied his core concept: a gun with wings attached, an aircraft built around its primary weapon rather than the weapon being an afterthought. The AC-130 gunship took the idea further, creating a flying weapons platform that could loiter over battlefields and deliver devastating firepower with precision. Modern close air support doctrine traced its lineage directly to the techniques Gunn had developed over the Bismarck Sea. He had proven that the manual was just a suggestion. That innovation came from people with dirty hands rather than people in suits. That one man with a welding torch and personal motivation could accomplish what committees of experts declared impossible. He had broken the back of the Japanese merchant marine with unauthorized field modifications, had changed the course of the Pacific War with scrapyard engineering, had built weapons that should not have worked but did. The lesson endured long after the man was gone. The person who adapts fastest wins. In war, in engineering, in any field where survival depends on solving problems faster than the enemy, the advantage goes to those willing to ignore what the experts say cannot be done. Gunn had wanted to get his kids back, and he had built a revolution in aerial warfare to accomplish it. The simplest motivation had produced the most profound results, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in innovation is not genius or resources, but the desperate determination of someone who has everything to lose.